Hey, how's it going? I hope you're well. I want to talk today about how being a cloud engineer can be better than being a DevOps engineer. So, let me explain. I was originally a sysadmin for many years, and I then became a cloud engineer. And I worked in a couple of different companies, and then after that is when I really became a DevOps engineer. Let's remember what a DevOps engineer is, because there's a lot of, disagreement, or more, there's a lot of abuse of the title. A DevOps engineer is an engineer who is responsible for automating in order to achieve faster software deployment. So they're not the primary person developing the software. That's obviously developers. But a DevOps engineer is kind of like when a company gets big enough that it wants the developers to focus on their primary job, which is developing, and don't anymore really focus on automation part related to deployment of the software with the aim of speeding it up. So that's what really a DevOps engineer is. And also, I would say, as a secondary sort of role, is to look after the site reliability, to look after the infrastructure. Because if the infrastructure, let's say the cloud infra, there's a big issue there, people aren't going to look at the developer, they're going to go look at the DevOps engineer. That's just the way it is. That's kind of just how it is. So that's what a DevOps engineer is. And I know a lot of people are attracted to it, first of all, maybe not first of all, but in a lot of cases, yeah, for the money. Because it's always been, for the last 10 years, really, really good money. And many people say it's not a junior role, it's a senior role. Well, there's some disagreement on that. I mean, some people say you need succession planning and there is such a thing as a junior DevOps engineer. I think there can be, honestly. But I get the point of what people are saying. It's, in general, a senior role. You're overseeing many different buckets. You got your fingers in many different pies. Let's say you're doing a lot of things. You need to know a lot. You need to see connections. A lot of this comes from experience, although it can also, a lot of it, be taught and be learned as well. So, and it's a super interesting job, as I'm sure any of you out there doing that job will agree. But it's also super stressful, and it's not all great. And some of the demands are just insane. And I personally think also that DevOps engineers, they're not treated as well as developers by the company as a whole. I know in many companies, developers are treated like gold. And I remember back when I used to work in a kind of like ops, before there was such a thing as DevOps. And where I worked then, the developers are treated like gold, and anyone else working in IT department or in tech was not treated anywhere near as good. And to some degree, I think that still exists. I still think the developers are treated really well, and they're allowed to be, even at times, antisocial, and you couldn't get away with that in a lot of other roles. But as a developer, you can get away with that because, special talents and all that. I don't know why, but people, even HR departments, will overlook it. Whereas I think as a DevOps engineer, you're still a little bit of a punching bag in the way that ops and IT support always has been. So it's better now than it's ever been, and DevOps is a fantastic career. However, what about cloud engineering? Cloud engineering is really, it sort of began with sysops, sysadmin starting to use the cloud. And what that opened up compared to on-prem, although it's now coming back to on-prem, is it opened up lots of new paradigms. Before that, in the old sysadmin days, there was a little bit of distributed computing. You might have had, for example, hardware load balancers in your data center. You might have had some kind of distributed computing when it came to, for example, very commonly with SQL Server database, things like that. But on the whole, it took the cloud to bring new paradigms such as high availability and real practical failover, not just disaster recovery and bringing up another site that's on a pilot light or standby or just completely turned off. So it brought a lot of new paradigms, and the modern cloud engineering job is actually a pretty good job. So actually in many companies, some of them are still just using point and click with the UI for their cloud, but the better ones are using Terraform. But you may be surprised as a DevOps engineer to know, and this is what got me on this. I was listening to something the other day about this, and it reminded me that in many companies that have a job cloud engineer, even if you're using Terraform, you may not be using any pipelines. You're just doing everything manually like an operator. Okay, it's in code, which is super great for all the reasons that we know. Having infrastructure as code is good. So at least they're doing something right. But many of them will just be operating Terraform from the command line. And I suppose if there was a GUI for Terraform, they would probably be using that. But they're doing it from the command line, and this is something new for them. They're not using pipelines. And remember, pipeline isn't just automation, because you could create a pipeline that's just a button for them, and then that's just convenience. Instead of running Terraform plan or Terraform apply, they can just hit a button. So the first level of a pipeline is obviously convenience, but we all know that what pipelines are really good is for much more than that. Is to have a process where you're creating a pull request and then getting a code review process in your team going, where somebody else, the 4 eyes principle. It's not only the person who creates the code, but someone else needs to look at it as well, the 4 eyes principle. And when you both agree, it then gets merged. And that's a paradigm that doesn't really always exist as a cloud engineer. You may be surprised to know. So there's kind of 2 ways to look at being a cloud engineer. One way to look at it is it's easier. It's lower stress. It's not as high stress, as dynamic as DevOps. That's one way to look at it. But and it is lower paid on the whole. But the way I prefer to look at it is it's also offers so much potential for you to go in there as an experienced DevOps engineer and radically change in a good way, radically improve the place, bring your knowledge, show your thought leadership, and be able to make even small, quick win, low-hanging fruit type improvements that they will love, because it just, for a lot of them, it just will never have occurred to them because they're not DevOps engineers. So it is great. There's a lot of opportunity there. And it's not just tech improvements either. It's also processes, and as I say, you're providing thought leadership. You can show them new paradigms, such as code review. As a DevOps engineer, we got a lot of stuff from the development world, right? Developers have been doing code review for a long time, but that wasn't always the case outside of development. And as DevOps engineers, we've taken those paradigms and we use them day in, day out. But a lot of this hasn't gotten transmitted yet to cloud engineering. So you can introduce not only technical enhancements, but also enhancements to the way that people work, the way that they think, how to question various things, just all kinds of things. So although ostensibly on the surface it's simpler to be a cloud engineer than it is a DevOps engineer, I think it is attractive because, as I say, there's a lot that you can do. And also, it may be that you're fed up with being a DevOps engineer. There's all this tools bingo and incessant disagreement over the right approach, and too many cooks spoil the broth, as they say, and sometimes just too many opinions. Sometimes it's just it's overly opinionated. And then you've got the demands in the business, and I hear a lot of people talking about DevOps being or feeling like some kind of impossible task. So consider maybe that cloud engineering could be your own way. Now, I just want to round off this video by saying there's 2 ways to do cloud engineering. One is to go in-house and it may be a company that doesn't develop anything, so it doesn't have any DevOps, but it still has cloud engineering, and that's one obvious place to start. There are also similar companies like that I would say do a medium or mid-level of development. So they have some internal developers, but development of software is not really integral to their business. Like, they could outsource that potentially, or they could maybe get an off-the-shelf product, but for whatever reason they've chosen to do some internal development. They're not really in the business of selling software to customers or to other businesses or anything like that. It's not the core of what they do. That is getting closer to DevOps, but never will be DevOps. So you've got those companies, and then in a totally different way you've also got services companies, and there are two types of services. There's managed services and there's professional services. Now, the words managed and professional, I mean, they could mean almost 101 different things, but in the space of the services industry within tech, they are specific things. They're basically consulting. So a managed service is where a company doesn't want to do any of their tech. They want to outsource it completely, and they evaluate and eventually choose upon one company to do all their tech for them. And this company that does their tech for them will also do the same for many other companies. So they're not typically going to get guaranteed the same people every day to help them, but they may get some who prefer to specialize with some clients and establish a relationship. Now, managed services, or MSPs as they call it, that's existed for a long time, even back in the sysadmin days. It is on the lower paid end, and I would say it used to be ops style work mostly, but it has gotten better in recent years because of the cloud and because of all the new paradigms. So it's not quite, I'll be frank, a lot of people say managed services is just shit, but it's not quite like that anymore, and I would say it's okay. It is definitely a bit more operational, and I don't mind that. I like good processes, I like runbooks, I like checklists, I like all that kind of stuff. The other side is professional services, and this is usually where you hear the word consulting. And professional services is where a company needs help, typically maybe migrating into the cloud or going through some stage of transition to becoming more and more cloud native. And they will engage, and there'll be a lot of meetings, first of all with sales, and pre-sales will be there, and there's a lot of talk and in the end eventually a lot of backslapping, I suppose. But they sign a deal typically for a year, and every year they'll look at the deal and decide whether to renew or not, or whether to just swap you out for another company. But it is a much more bespoke, tailor-made service. You really listen to what they're trying to achieve as a business, and then you go about devising how you can deliver on that technically to allow them to enable their business, to allow them to achieve those business goals. And then typically you could deploy maybe, 2 or 3 engineers, or it could be an entire team of 10, 20, 30, possibly more, but that's quite rare. So you start small, you expand quite often. There's a constant level of engagement there. There's program management, project management, and then eventually for the cloud engineer, you work with a project manager in your company who is in touch usually on the other side with another project manager, or maybe a product manager, or whatever it is, but someone doing the stakeholder management. You've got two sides in your company, the services company, professional services, and you got another person on the other side. There's typically a close relationship, but eventually the work filters down to you as an engineer to do. And yeah, you go in there, you've got to give really good client service, you've got to keep that utmost in mind. You're not just what they call a body shop, you're not just there to be a head count. You really got to treat them like gold, I suppose. But you got to be honest with them as well, and they're looking to you for thought leadership, and you have to have an opinion because that's what they've hired you for. But of course, their decision matters in the end and overrules even yours. So you can argue with them a little bit, but never take it too far. And you say, okay, well, these are the choices, these are the trade-offs, this is my recommendation, but whatever you decide goes. And that's it. And then you deliver on the work, and you'll be doing typical work. Typically a lot of infrastructure as code, Terraform, maybe some scripting, but a lot of it will be infrastructure as code. So yeah, getting back to like comparing it to DevOps again, although you might have to set up pipelines, and they may have some of the common elements that you've seen, it won't get too crazy. You might not even be implementing Kubernetes. It might just be VMs. You might not be implementing anywhere near the amount of vendor tooling, Kafka or any kind of crazy database setup. They'll typically be using a lot of cloud native stuff, and then that can always change later. In Kubernetes, like I said, they might not always be using that. You certainly won't be installing a whole bunch of tools on Kubernetes. That will be left for them to do in their own teams. So then you'll be there for a year or maybe 6 months, and then you'll move off, and it's a nice way to close a chapter, and you move on to another client. And typically you'll do between 1 and 3 clients. I've talked quite a lot about professional services, but I just wanted to mention it because it is quite a good job, I will say. And even an ordinary cloud engineer in-house is also a great job. So consider, DevOps is not everything. Consider also being a cloud engineer, and it can be better. And it won't typically pay the top of what, like, say, a senior DevOps engineer or senior staff or principal will pay. It'll probably never get quite that high, but you'll probably have a better work-life balance, and work will still interest you a great deal, and there's a lot that you can do. So consider it. DevOps is not the be-all and the end-all. It absolutely isn't. So consider other things too. I hope you found this video interesting. I'll see you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.